Hello, I'm Andrea Obstin. I want to tell you a little bit about 5 Simsbury residents who were recently recognized at the first 60 over 60 awards. These awards, created by Duncaster, honor Connecticut citizens over the age of 60 who continue to make a difference in the lives of others or in their communities. This is the first year the awards were presented. Duncaster began the search for 60 individuals who are making a difference in our community in January. They received nominations from business associates, friends, family, and people who admire the accomplishments of those in their communities. Among those chosen for the first class of 60 over 60 Connecticut were people who dedicated their lives to public service, authors, artists, poets, volunteers, caregivers, healthcare professionals, and executives with some of the state's most influential institutions. Those chosen are pioneers and change makers. They broke rules. They made new ones. They did things first and they kick-started change. They made history and they honored it. The recipients came from 25 towns across the state of Connecticut. With us today is one of those 60 over 60 winners, Simsbury resident William Eddy. He was nominated by Molly Gavin, president of Connecticut Community, Inc., for his activism on the part of older adults. Welcome, William.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So you have had multiple careers over your lifetime. Tell us about the first.
The very first career?
Well, yeah, let's go through how we got to the point where you became someone who continues to make change.
I guess the very beginning was after getting out of the Navy and which followed college. I went to work with Aetna Life and Casualty and was in their group division for a year or two, and then moved to their financial division, briefly in common stocks, but primarily in an area called bond investment, which was private placements, private debt placements to small, medium, and large-sized companies around the country. And then I moved from there into the diversified operations of the Aetna, and actually was instrumental in making an acquisition, helping make an acquisition. All of this was participatory with others, into the commercial finance business, which later became Aetna Business Credit. And at Aetna Business Credit, the leader that we brought in, which I had a hand in, reached out and asked for me to come over and join him. And I ended up being his treasurer. After Aetna Business Credit thrived, it was also sold by the Aetna. And I moved from the financial arena into banking, also the financial arena, but also as the treasurer of Hartford National, CNB, and Shawmut. And at the end of that period, I had spent 37 years in finance or related activities, and I ended up retiring at the age of 60. And about 61, I turned to a friend of mine who happened to be an attorney with the Aetna, and I said, his name was Locke McLean. He just passed away this past year. I said, you know, Locke, I'd like to learn something about the legislative process.
So your second career was really just about educating yourself about the legislative process?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the way I started. And I should say that in the last 15 years of my business career, my father had a major stroke. And both my father and mother ended up being cared for at home. I ran a nursing operation, a caregiving operation.
In their home.
In their home.
Yes.
And I would stop by every night to see how they were doing. And then my father had had the major stroke, I kept asking the doctor, doctor, you said that you didn't think my father was going to live out the year. And I did that for 5 years, and finally he said, Bill, quit asking.
Quit asking.
But he had such a good life, even though he could only say a few words. And he needed lots of physical therapy. But one thing that was very interesting about that part of my career, which was the tail end of my business career, was that I would stop by after a hectic day's work, just totally wrung out, how could I possibly spend time? And I'd sit down and I'd start talking to my dad, who couldn't talk. He could actually say one swear word, but he also had another word, and he would say, oh, really? Well, after I had, how many people can go through a dialogue with somebody, and after they've said something, he says, oh, really? And then pretty soon, it was just like I was being psychoanalyzed.
That's right. How do you feel about that?
I was totally debriefed at the end of the day. And so that turned out to be a very significant development for me, because just the caregiving episode and how happy he was at home.
So
totally
that
happy.
Led you into
the people, and that didn't lead me into the legislative process. The legislative process I wanted to learn about on my own.
Okay.
But my friend Locke McLean said, here, why don't you join the AARP group, which was then all, and as a volunteer, and which was then all volunteer. They had maybe one salaried person who covered 2 or 3 states, but they didn't have a salaried group like they do now. And they have a combination of salaried group people and volunteers. So that group that I joined was the Capital City Task Force, and that related to their business operations dealings with the state legislature on bills that they would like to see proceed through the legislature if they were considered to have merit.
Had you ever done this kind of work before?
No, never. And in the process, you learned how to testify. You learned the pecking order of the legislators. You learned you just learned through observation. And I did that for 10 years. And during that period, 2 things happened. One was I was initially put on these nursing home task forces, and that was pretty much what long-term care was all about.
Yes.
They weren't talking too much about home care, and it was kind of like a fledgling industry, except that everybody knows that the major part of home care is family.
Yes.
And
exactly.
And the end process of that was we did one piece of legislation, which was actually putting in the state statutes some kind of statement to the effect that if the government agencies in the state of Connecticut are the relevant ones are considering doing something for the nursing home industry, at the same time they should consider doing something for the home care industry.
And that was part of your efforts getting that part in?
I participated in that very heavily.
You were quite the fixture at the Capitol for a while.
And that the second thing that we did was that during that period there was a loose-knit group of people that came together to form the Long-Term Care Advisory Council.
Yes.
And the Long-Term Care Advisory Council advised the State Long-Term Care Planning Committee. Initially, we wanted to become part of the Planning Committee because wouldn't that make an awful lot of sense, having the state employees and leaders and their relative divisions that related to caregiving, long-term care, like transportation or aging or something like that. Wouldn't that make sense to also involve us as volunteers on the planning committee. Well, no, we can't do that.
That's too easy.
We don't want to. No, that's very, yeah, right. That's too logical. So they allowed us to create the Long-Term Care Advisory Council, and we were headed up by a fellow that, a legislator by the name of Peter Villano, who was also in the House, and I think was a co-chair of the Aging Committee, that kind of thing, and so those were the two things while I was at AARP that were significant, because the Molly Gavins of this world, who is a very significant leader of Connecticut Community Care Inc., and which is just a first-class home care operation that's devoted to coordinating care for individuals, and who need various types of care, various types of long-term care.
You got involved with Connecticut Community Care, too.
Yes, I did. But I became a corporator.
Yep. And you got an individual advocacy award, if I remember correctly.
Yes, she did that.
She did that.
But the process that at the end of that process, what I was involved in, because I was on the Long-Term Care Advisory Council as a representative of AARP, I got to know a lot of people, and I also became I knew a lady by the name of Julie Evans Starr.
Oh, yes.
And Julie and Molly were on the same Long-Term Care Advisory Council. And Julie was heading up the Commission on Aging, which was housed under the I have a memory blank. It was housed under the administration, under DSS.
Oh, yeah, that's
Department
right.
of Social Services. And whereas the other, and she was in a policy advisory role, policy making, supporting the then DSS, which prior to that it had a Department of Aging, but then it had disappeared. And anyway, it was a commission that was over under Department of Social Services, but it was more relevant to the legislative process and to the legislature, because it itself was an advocate,
right,
for good things,
right,
good policy. And here you had the Commission on Women, Commission on Children, and a couple of other commissions.
Yeah, they were dedicated to specific audiences.
But they were all dedicated to the advocacy role.
Okay,
and
so that's where
so
that fit
at that juncture, I joined the Commission on Aging, and it was a commission of 3, and then they got lopped to a commission of 1.
Yeah, commission of 1,
which was Julie Evans Starr, because every time they had a difficult budget to meet, they would tend to. They, being the legislature and the governor, would tend to lop off what they called was low-hanging fruit, and it wasn't really low-hanging fruit. It was a fledgling operation. But anyway, the net result of that was that we made a big pitch to move from the administrative branch under the governor to which was primarily focused on making things work,
yep, on
operations, whereas the advisory commission on aging was focused on policy.
Right.
And policy is generally even though the governor's very interested in it, but it's generally the province of the legislature. And the legislature, under, I think it was Kevin Sullivan and Jonathan Harris, but Kevin Sullivan was very instrumental in bringing us over, and that began my real education in terms of the legislative process.
Becoming an advocate.
Yeah, because AARP, it was hands-on, and I was very involved,
Right.
And loved the experience. But the Commission on Aging was inside the dome. AARP was outside the dome.
Yes, exactly.
And inside the dome, the relationships with the network of people and not only advocates, but the network of providers like Molly's
Yes.
operation, CCCI, was growing. And under the leadership of Julie Evans Starr, who was co-chair at that point in time with the Long-Term Care Advisory Council, and the Molly Gavins of this world, it grew.
And that counts. That was a very some of the things that group came up with, very groundbreaking. Put Connecticut really on the forefront of some very interesting and new things about the way you treat older adults.
Oh, it did. And we got over there, we being the Commission on Aging, then I just changed hats. And one of the first things we did after being transferred over was help to create the Connecticut Long-Term Care website.
Yep.
And it still has, even though it's gone through a couple of evolutions, it still has our fingerprints on it.
So you went from knowing how to push around numbers until they screamed to this advocacy role as your second, third career.
But interestingly enough, for me,
Yeah.
I'd been a caregiver.
Right.
For 17 years.
So you had that that was kind of the bridge to the next career.
Yeah, it really was. And
a lot of what the 60 over 60 Connecticut Awards were about is about people who are still making things happen well into their 60s. Are you thinking about yet another career? Is that on the horizon?
If my body will permit, I wouldn't mind at all, because it was such a wonderful experience. After I retired from business and joined as a volunteer into this career of advocacy for older adults with two different organizations, actually, it became my encore career.
Yes.
And I so appreciated it, and I was so grateful to the people who made it happen. And Julie and Molly were those people.
And Molly was the person who nominated you for the 60 over 60 awards. Tell us about your reaction to that, because this is the first year.
Well, what I said was I responded to Mr. The head of Duncaster,
Michael O'Brien?
O'Brien.
Yes.
Mr. O'Brien. And I said how thrilled I was with the honor. And it came as a great surprise, and thank you very much. And at the end of my letter, I said, and I shall be sure to punish Molly.
We got nominations, and people were like, thank you for the honor, but do we have to sort of underscore the over 60 part? And the bottom line is that all of us over 60 are still very much involved in making change, and that was the whole purpose of the awards.
Yeah.
You're one of those people.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you being part of the first class, and hopefully you'll be involved next year. Maybe nominating some people or serving as one of our judges.
Oh, I don't know about that, but I would encourage anybody who is retiring from one career, a business career, say, or a career to make a living, and can handle the voluntary side without getting income. it can be a very, very rewarding experience.
Talk about that. Talk about the rewards of that second career, whether it's paid or on. I mean,
Well, it's all psychological. I mean, I had things happen during my during this career with both AARP and with the Commission on Aging that were very meaningful to me and put a lot of things in perspective. I even had at one point an individual who approached me who asked me if I would be her personal care assistant, and this was somebody that was severely disabled.
wow.
And I think that was such a touching thing that I couldn't put my arms around it. You know, it was just very touching. And
Very different career than what you started on.
So you meet a lot of dedicated people, and I'm sure there are plenty of other areas where people can contribute and be volunteers. And if anybody's as lucky as I am, they're going to be thrilled with the aftermath.
Well, William Eddy, winner and member of the first class of 60 over 60 Connecticut, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much.
You just met one of the 60 over 60 Connecticut honorees, Bill Eddy. Tune in again for further shows when we learn a little bit more about some of the fascinating people from Simsbury. There are 5 of them who are honored at this year's awards. And pay attention, because in 2018, we will be looking for other nominations for the 60 over 60 Connecticut. Thank you for watching.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.